Good day. Welcome to another session of Fog Accountancy Tutorials. Today I'm going to continue our study on CVP analysis by looking at the chart, the break-even chart. Okay, I'm going to take my time to explain the break-even chart for you, and I'm going to take a simple approach from the cost behavior concept. So please just watch what I'm going to do. Now, under normal circumstance, we have the traditional break-even chart and then we have the contribution chart. Okay. Now, I'm going to first talk about the traditional and then I also talk about the contribution chart. But you see, what I always say is that as a student of management accounting, you should be able to draw the chart without plotting any figures. You should understand the movement of the curves or the lines on the graphs to the extent that even without figures to plot, you should be able to draw. But I'm going to first of all teach you with the figures, and then afterwards I will teach you how to draw without the figures. Okay. Now let us look at these figures. Let's assume we have, let's say, units or outputs, total fixed costs, total variable cost, and then total cost. And then we have revenue or sales revenue. If you have maybe at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units, total fixed cost 20 throughout, 20 cedis throughout. And let's say variable cost, okay, so let me begin from unit 0. Total fixed cost will still be 20. Total variable cost will be 0 when there is no unit produced. And so let me use, okay, let me say at 1 is 10, 20, 30, 40, because you already know the concept of variable cost, that it changes in proportion to the changes in level of output. And then it means that total cost is going to be total fixed cost plus variable cost. So we have 20 cedis for total cost under 0 units, 30, 40, 50, 60, and 70. So that is it. Now, let us also estimate some revenues. I just want to use these simple figures to help you draw the break-even chart. So let's say revenue, when we are producing at 3, revenue is 50, and then revenue at 0 units is 0, at 1 is 20, revenue at 2 units is, let's say, 35. And then when we produce 4, we get revenue of, let's say, 65. When we produce 5, we get revenue of 80. Let's say this is what we have, okay, for now to plot. So we are going to plot this on a graph. So y-axis, x-axis. This is a hand sketch. So pardon me if it is not very straight. I'm just trying to explain something to you with that. So this is 0, the origin. So the x-axis will be the units, and the y-axis will represent the cost and revenue. That is in Ghana cedis. All right, so let me just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units. And then also the range for the revenue is from 0 to 80. So cost 2 is up to 70. So I can use 10, 10. Let me try and see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and 100. All right, so let us begin the plotting. Now, in the traditional break-even chart, we don't plot the variable cost. So variable cost will be out, even though we all know the movement of variable cost. Okay, so let us try and plot our fixed cost, our total cost, and our total revenue. That is what we are plotting. We are not plotting the total variable cost because it begins from 0, it moves in the same direction with total revenue, there will be confusion. And since our focus is on revenue and cost, let us first of all ignore the variable cost. But when we are looking at the contribution, we are also going to plot total variable cost as well. Here, we are looking at the traditional break-even chart. So now, you see that we are plotting units against any of the things in the currency. Now, first, we are plotting total fixed cost. And if you are plotting total fixed cost, it means it's your units against the total fixed cost. If you are plotting total cost, it's still your units against the total cost. If you are plotting revenue, it's your units against the revenue. That is what it means. The units will always be for the x-axis. So let us begin plotting the total cost. Now, whenever the unit produced is 0, total fixed cost is 20. So at 0, it is 20. So this is where we plot it, 0 and 20. And when the unit produces 1, total fixed cost is still 20. So at 1, it is still 20. You could see that here. And again, when unit produces 2, total fixed cost is the same 20. So still like that. And at 3, still 20. So you see that the total cost, fixed cost remains the same. At 4 is 20. At 5 is still 20. So you can see that this is how the line will look for the total fixed cost. So the fixed cost line will be drawn through like that. Please pardon me because I'm just using a free hand to draw. But at least it explains why the fixed cost line goes this way on a straight line. This is the explanation. You see, we know from cost behavior that this is the fixed cost line. But some of us don't know why it is like that. So when you are plotting it, that is what you get. If you are plotting the variable cost, you are going to get this way. If you are plotting revenue, it should also go that way, okay, from the origin, but the fixed cost will not go. But if you are plotting total cost, we know it doesn't go from the origin. So this is total cost, this is total fixed cost, this is variable cost, this is revenue. So these things, we know them from the theory of cost behavior, but we have not proved them yet. And this is the explanation for that. And so we are done plotting the fixed cost. So that is our fixed cost. Now that we are done plotting the fixed cost, let us also plot total cost. I said we are not plotting total variable cost, please. So we are plotting the total cost. So unit against total cost. So let's begin. At unit 0, total cost is 20. So 0, 20. So you see, it begins the same point where the fixed cost line began. When the unit produces 0, total cost is still 20. If it was a variable cost, it would have been 0, 0. It will all begin from the origin. These things, many of us have been drawing the sketch with the cost behavior, but we don't really understand why they move the way they move. So when we are plotting the units at 0, total cost is 20. So that will be 0 against 20. So it begins the same point where fixed cost began. Then when the unit produces 1, total cost is 30. So 1 against 30 will move up like that. So we plot it somewhere here. Okay. And then 2 against 40. So unit 2 against 40. So we can trace like that. And then we plot. I hope you are following. Then unit 3 against 3 units against 50. So we can still trace. And then we match it. And then 4 units against 60 total cost. So we can trace 4 units up there like that. And then 5 units against 70 for the total cost. So 5, 70 can be traced. Okay, so it means that these are the points we have plotted. So we are going to join them. It began from where the fixed cost line begins. So through the points like that, straight up. Sorry for the crooked line. At least it explains something. So this becomes your total cost line. And that is why the total cost line does not begin from the origin. Because even when you are not producing, you are incurring fixed cost. And therefore, total cost line begins from the point of the fixed cost, upwards like that. So this is our total cost line. We are plotting all on the same graph so that it will explain to you the break-even point. And then finally, let us plot the revenue against the units. So at unit 0, revenue is 0. So the first point is plotted in the origin. Then when unit 1, we produce 1, the revenue is 20. So at 1, it matches 20. So 1 and 20 will be somewhere here. And then when we are producing 2 units, we are getting revenue of 35. So we can trace 2 up to 35. Okay, 35 will be somewhere here in between 30 and 40. So we can plot that here. And then when we are producing 3 units, we are getting revenue of 50. So 3 units, we can trace 3 up to 50. And it's the same point here that we plotted. Because it means that the cost and the revenue at 3 units is the same. So at 3 units, total cost is 50, total revenue is 50, no profit, no loss. So what it means is that there is a break-even. So that means that the break-even point in units is 3. Okay, and we are going to illustrate that with the graph. Meaning that over here, we are having total cost of 40, total revenue of 35. There is a loss, there is a loss, there is a loss. Then after the break-even point, you see that we started making profit. Where the cost was 60, we got revenue of 65. Where the cost was 70, we had revenue of 80. So right after the break-even point, you start making your profit. Now, we have done plotting that. Then at unit 4, 65. So we trace 4 up towards 65. And 65 is somewhere in between the 60 and 70. And then finally, at 5 units, we trace it up to 80. So we can trace it, and then we get our 80 somewhere here. So let us begin to join the points again and see with free hands. Forgive me if it gets crooked. Sorry, I've made a mistake. It goes through this, through that. Oh. Still crooked. Forgive me, I've not been so perfect with the lines. Okay, so it means we have our total revenue line completed. Okay, so now please remember that the only thing we didn't plot is the total variable cost. Okay, now this is what we are going to do. Looking at the break-even chart, you can see that there is a point where total cost and total revenue lines meet. That point is the break-even point. It means at that point, there is no profit nor loss. So when you trace that point down on your graph, it traces down to 3. So you can use your graph to find the break-even point in units, and you can trace it to the left to find your break-even point in value. So break-even point in value is 50, break-even point in units is 3. You can just trace it. So if you do accurate plotting, you may not need to even verify from your information. You can, and you need to show, if the examiner says use your graph to find the break-even point in unit, it means that you are going to show the trace of the line from left to right, so that this will be your break-even point in value, and this will be your break-even point in units. That's the meaning. Now, there is one more thing I need to let you understand. We know that after the break-even point, we make profit. Below the break-even point is loss. So this small area down here, we call it the loss area. And then up here, this small space, we call it the profit area. The area between the total revenue and the total cost. We call it the profit area. Now, let me also say something. If your budgeted unit is, let's say, 50, okay? If your budgeted unit is 58, sorry. If your budgeted unit is 5 units, then what it means is that in between your break-even point and your budgeted units, we call it the margin of safety. You know that the margin of safety is your budgeted unit minus your break-even point in unit. So in between 3 and 5 is the margin of safety. So we can trace it like that up, and then we can call this whole portion the margin of safety. And then if we trace it from the total revenue to the left, we can call in between the 50 and the budgeted sales revenue of 80 also a margin of safety in value. So, I mean, these are the dynamics of what we call the break-even chart. So I have tried to use these figures to explain to you what we mean by the traditional break-even chart. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this, and I'm going to use my hand to do a free sketch for you to understand what we have meant all this while. Some of us have not understood the chart because we have not used figures to explain to you. Okay. Now, let us do a quick recap of what we have learned from the chart so far. So let's assume this is the graph, the origin, units, and then in values, that is cost and revenue. So with a freehand sketch, I can do this and call it the fixed cost. Total cost line begins from here. So this is the total cost. This is a summary of all that we've done. And then revenue begins from the origin, up like that, revenue or sales. Then I'm going to call this portion the loss area. I'll call this place the profit area. And then I'll trace this point down and call it the break-even point in units. I'll trace the same point to the left and call it the break-even point in sales value. I'm sure this diagram, you've now understood it. Then, if this is my budgeted units, if this is my budgeted revenue, then it means that the distance between the two, this place, I'm going to call it margin of safety in units, and I'll call this place margin of safety, that is in value. Some of you have seen this diagram over and over again, but you've struggled to interpret it. But I have tried to use that which I did earlier to help you understand the chart very well. So this is the break-even chart. This is the traditional break-even chart. All right. So I'm sure this is now very understandable for you. Profit area, loss area, margin of safety, margin of safety. And the only thing we did not plot here is the variable cost. But we're going to do that in the contribution break-even chart. So let me quickly clean this and then teach you or explain the contribution break-even chart as well. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the contribution chart. Now, the contribution chart is not different from the traditional chart. In fact, it's the same thing, only that this time we are introducing variable cost. So the difference between the traditional and the contribution is that in the traditional, there is no variable cost emphasis on the graph, even though it exists. But in the contribution, we are introducing the variable cost, but we may not also draw the fixed cost line. So that's the difference. In the contribution, we are not going to bring the fixed cost line, even though it's implied. Then in the traditional, we brought the fixed cost line. We didn't bring the variable cost line. And so let us quickly look at that as well. Now remember that, let us revise these things. That the fixed cost line goes like this. Variable cost goes like that. Total cost or mixed cost begins from where the fixed cost is upward like that. Remember this from cost behavior. And then revenue line also begins from the origin and moves up like that. So you should take note of these things because the knowledge that you had from theory of cost behavior is the same that we apply for CVP analysis. Now we have the origin, we have cost and revenue, and then we have the units. Now, as usual, we know we should have drawn the fixed cost line first, but we're not going to do that, okay? We assume that the fixed cost is already implied. So if this is the point of the fixed cost, we can draw our total cost line without drawing the fixed cost. Of course, we know that we could have done this first before doing the total cost line. But what I'm saying is that even though the fixed cost is implied, you don't draw the line in the contribution chart. That's the meaning. So this is the total cost line, and you see where I started the total cost line from. That even tells you that there is an implied fixed cost somewhere before it protrudes up. Now, the variable cost line begins from the origin and must be parallel to the total cost line. I repeat, the variable cost line must be parallel to the total cost line. So I may not be too accurate with a freehand sketch, but something like this. You show that parallel nature of it. So variable cost. So something like this. You see that these two lines will never meet. They are behaving in a parallel manner. Okay, so that is it. Please take note that the variable cost and the total cost line must be parallel. Then you can draw your revenue line from the origin, but shouldn't necessarily be parallel to any. So you begin from here up like that. So this is the revenue or total sales. Now you see, so nothing has really changed. All we have done is that we have eliminated the fixed cost line and we have brought in the variable cost line. Now watch what I'm going to do. Nothing has really changed. It is still the play of total cost and total revenue. And where they meet is your break-even point. So you trace it down, you get your break-even point in units. Now please take note that there are some questions that even though you may be giving figures to plot on the graph, you are not really going to get any figure showing you a clear break-even sign. So it means that when you trace from your graph, that is where you're actually going to get your break-even point. It could be in decimals, so please take note. And then we can trace to the left to get a break-even point in value. So that is it. Now, we all know that as we all know, the same way, this is the loss area and this is the profit area. The area before and after the break-even point. But we are going to introduce one more area. You see that in between the variable cost and the revenue is the contribution area. Because we know that selling price or sales revenue minus total revenue gives us the total contribution. Okay? And so in between here, your total revenue up to the variable cost, you call it contribution. Please take note. From the revenue line to the variable cost line, in between is your contribution area. Because revenue minus variable cost is contribution. Then we also know that total cost minus variable cost is your fixed cost. And so you are going to also show this. In between the total cost line and the variable cost, you call it fixed cost area. So look at this very carefully. In between the revenue line and the variable cost line is your contribution area, but between the total cost line and the variable cost line is your fixed cost area. That is what we mean. Okay, and it's the fixed cost area that causes the two lines to be parallel in that nature. But remember that contribution is always greater than fixed cost. That is if you are making a profit. But if you are making a loss, contribution is smaller than fixed cost. If you are breaking even, contribution equals to fixed cost. We have explained these concepts from the part 1 and 2 of this lesson. So you can go back and revise and then you come back to understand what I'm trying to explain. So this is your fixed cost area and this is your contribution area. And remember that the margin of safety will still hold under the contribution chart. So there is a slight difference between the contribution chart and the traditional chart. But I'm hoping that this is not so confusing. You should be able to go over it again and then try and understand what I mean. So if you were using figures to plot, it means on this graph, you are not going to plot the fixed cost, but you would have rather plotted the variable cost, and it's going to give you the same shape that I have given you on the graph. Okay. This will bring us to the end of part 4 of our lesson on CVP analysis. If you are new, I will urge you to subscribe to this channel, share this video, and let others also have a benefit. And until we meet again for another video, it's bye for now.